Kia tau na manaakitanga a te mea naro. Ki runga ki tēnā o tātou. Kia māhia te hua, mā kihi. Kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori. Kia tūturu ka whakamaua kia tīna, hui e, tai ki e. Ko ranganui e tui hone, ko pāpa tuanuku e takato ake nei. Me a rawa tamariki nui tonu, kei te mihi. Ki te hunga mate kua mate, moi mai rā. Ki te tangata whenua o Aotearoa katoa he tiaki ina hika o konei, kei te mihi. Ki te mana whenua o te whanganui ātara, ara ko taranaki whānui, ko te Aotearoa, ko Ngāti Toa Rangatira, kei te mihi. Ki ngā kai kōrero o te huine ara ko Terry Bellamack, ko Hannah Blake, ko Angus Lindsay, he toha i o koutou mā tauranga, kei te mihi. Kia koutou katoa kua whakapiri ki te whakarongo whakaako hoki, kei te mihi. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our webinar, Misogyny and the Far Right. We're really excited to have this important discussion in preparation for our counter protest on Saturday at 12:30 against the anti-abortion march. I just want to take the opportunity to tell you that you might enjoy this Zoom most if you turn on your speaker view at the top right-hand corner of your screen. There's 8 or 9 little dots, and you can turn it on to speaker view. And before I turn to our speakers, I want to take a moment to set the scene and to acknowledge some voices in this discussion. It's critical to understand that the misogyny we experience here is a specific and deliberate product of the colonization of Aotearoa. Scholar Tina Ngata says in respect of white identity extremism that colonial violence is not an accessory to this conversation, it is the conversation. The very same can be said about misogyny. Rape featured in the colonization of Aotearoa throughout our history. It occurred at the hands of Captain Cook's crew. It occurred as a tool of the land wars at Rangiowahia, at Parihaka, and at Mongapohatu. It continues in all aspects of our politics today, from the uplift of babies by Oranga Tamariki to the statistics that we see Māori women as the fastest growing segment of the prison population. We cannot discuss misogyny without discussing colonization in this country. There are so many people working in this field. I just want to acknowledge a few people doing some of that work to dismantle misogyny in the context of colonization. First, my own tuaka, Nasina Brown-Davis, for the ongoing consciousness raising and anti-fascist organizing that she's been committed to for her whole life. She is truly Antifa. I also want to acknowledge the scholars, activists, and lawyers, including Georgina Tuari-Smith, Nahuya Murphy, Tina Ngata, Aroha Yates-Smith, Annie Makairi, Robin Kahukiwa, Cassie Hardendorp, Elizabeth Kitty, Te Ao Pritchard, Dale Marie Morgan, Annette Sykes, Tracy McIntosh, Ahi Wihongi, and all of those involved in the Manawahine claim. So turning now to our speakers, we've got 3 amazing people who will address different aspects of misogyny and its relationship to the far right. I'm just going to introduce all 3 of them, and then we'll turn to our first speaker. First is Terry Bellamack. Terry served as the president of Alran's Abortion Rights Aotearoa from 2015 to 2021. She still sits on the Alran's executive board. She is a former executive at Goldman Sachs. And since 2012, Terry has been a citizen of New Zealand. She received her LLB, her law degree, from Victoria University and has worked in dispute resolution. In 2019, she was named the finalist for New Zealand Women of Influence Awards. In 2020, Aotearoa's goal of reforming New Zealand's abortion laws was achieved under the Labour government. Abortion has been legalized and is now treated as healthcare under the New Zealand health system. Terry and Aotearoa continue their work holding the government to account for the equitable implementation of the new abortion provision system. Our second speaker is Hannah Blake. Hannah is a Pākehā woman who grew up in Aotearoa and was raised being homeschooled in a fundamentalist Christian environment. As an adult, she is trying to raise awareness around Christian homeschooling culture, Christian nationalism, and alt-right communities who have influence in our country. She is doing this because in her experience and her observation, these communities are actively working to normalize and spread misogyny, LGBTQIA+ bigotry, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism, especially against tangata whenua. And finally, Angus Lindsay. Angus is a PhD candidate in criminology in the School of Social and Cultural Studies at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University. Angus's master's degree explored anti-feminism within online incel communities. Involuntary celibate, if you're not familiar with that term, incel. His broad research interests include the analysis of far-right communities and their use of digital technologies to facilitate extremism. Angus has also published critical accounts of police intelligence and colonial policing in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So each speaker will have about 20 minutes, and we're going to take questions at the end of the session for all of the speakers. You're welcome to post questions in the chat if you don't prefer to ask them. So please note that this session obviously is being recorded. So if you don't want your image captured, please feel free to turn your camera off. Thank you all again for being with us tonight. We hope you enjoy the kōrero. Now over to Terry. Terry, thanks for being with us. And we're going to have some screen sharing from Terry.
Hi. Kia ora, everybody. Thanks for showing up. And before I get started with the screen sharing, etc., I just have a few words that I wanted to say just as a disclaimer. Alrans and I myself are fully committed to trans inclusiveness as a matter of official policy and also an abiding sense of fairness. I want to clarify what I mean by some of the terms I'm going to be using tonight. In discussing pregnancy and abortion, I use the term pregnant people or just people. This is because pregnancy is a physical construct that can be experienced by anybody with a uterus. The term woman is a social construct that describes a group of people burdened and obligated by patriarchy in a particular way. So when I use the term woman, I mean this social construct. I hope that's clear, and I'm happy to talk about this more offline. Also, just a content note about a few of my slides. Some of the slides have material that some folks may find objectionable or upsetting, like photos with images of dead fetuses and images of bigoted comments. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Does that look right? Good. Excellent. So this topic, misogyny on the far right with respect to reproductive rights, is a very big topic. I chose to focus on misogyny as it manifested in public during the struggle for reproductive rights. Now, far right opposition to abortion has produced very little that's new in the way of sexist theory. Instead, it relies on the same old misogynist stereotypes about women's intellectual and moral inferiority to justify the one new thing that it did produce: fear and violence outside abortion clinics. That's my topic today. So today we're going to be talking about the New Zealand experience of far-right misogyny and clinic harassment compared to the situation in the United States, both historically and more recently. I'm talking about both countries because anti-abortion groups in New Zealand have looked to the US for energy, ideas, possibly money, although no one has been able to prove that. And because the US is kind of an anti-abortion super spreader. It exports its pathologies all over the world, including here. So I'm going to talk about the different kinds of misogyny that anti-abortion groups have used over time. Take a look at Operation Rescue, which was active in both places with very different results. Look at how Operation Rescue engendered a fear of violence that persists today. And finally, I'm going to talk about whether there might be synergies between the far-right ideology and mainstream anti-abortion activism in New Zealand. So there's different kinds of misogyny that people have used for different purposes. The benevolent sexism tries really hard not to hold women responsible for getting abortions, in spite of the fact that pregnant people have to go to a lot of trouble to get them and don't just trip and fall onto the operating table. Mainstream anti-abortion groups in New Zealand push benevolent sexism when they say stuff like, love them both, or abortion claims two victims. It basically disappears people's autonomy and sovereignty over themselves and reduces them to the moral status of children. The subtext is women are dumb. Second up is to the moderators of are we muted or?
You're not muted, Terry. I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I can. Okay, cool. So, okay, onward. So violent misogyny is what you see outside abortion services, where the protesters are out there slut shaming patients and calling them murderers, or, pelting them with baby doll parts daubed in red paint, which has actually happened in Colorado. The subtext is women are evil. And finally, disappearing the pregnant person. This happens in different ways. The ultrasound in utero or dismembered fetus photos that you see in anti-abortion protests quite a lot. These are examples of disappearing the pregnant person because they diminish the pregnant person into a mere place. The silent scream is a popular example of this type of propaganda. But pregnant people also get disappeared legally when, for instance, the harm caused by clinic protests is framed as property offenses or trespass. So, Operation Rescue. In the US, Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, and the backlash really kicked up in the 1980s. In 1986, Randall Terry, and that's the guy in the middle, started Operation Rescue, a Christian far-right anti-abortion group that engaged in direct action against providers and patients to physically prevent patients from getting abortions and to threaten providers with violence. Operation Rescue raised the threat level for abortion clinics. Their tactics were co-opted from civil rights and anti-war struggles, like sit-ins in clinics or blocking the clinic doors. They would announce a target city in which they would set up a media barrage with speeches and rallies and pickets and lots of conflict. They were met with counter-protests from pro-choice activists, which resulted in arrests on both sides. But the conflict was good for their bottom line. They took in lots of money in donations, over $1 million a year at their peak, and the media ate it up. As time went on, the violence stepped up. In the 1990s, Operation Rescue began calling for violence more explicitly with the phrase, "If you think abortion is murder, act like it." Terry's colleague, Keith Tucci, said, "It is your God-given right to destroy any man or woman calling themselves doctors who willingly slaughter innocent children." Their violent rhetoric inspired others to engage in violence against providers and patients independently, like Neil Horsley, the creator of the Nuremberg Files website, which published the names, home addresses, work addresses, and photos of abortion providers to make it easy for those who might want to do them violence to find them. Mob violence against people attending the clinics was more ad hoc and less focused on specific people for obvious reasons. But it was still terrifying to have to walk through a gauntlet of screaming people trying to grab you. The National Abortion Federation has compiled a list of statistics on violence directed against abortion providers and patients. And in the past 40 years, they racked up 11 murders, 26 attempted murders, 363 instances of bombing, arson, or attempted, 472 invasions, and 2,133 examples of vandalism. And the majority of these cases occurred during the 1990s, which was also a time of expansion for other far-right terrorist activity, like the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, in New Zealand, there was a local chapter of Operation Rescue. It became active briefly between 1988 and 1993. A group of 4 men tried to rescue the unborn in Wellington by harassing providers and patients outside the Parkview Clinic. But they were arrested and prosecuted. After that, actions by Operation Rescue were met with large counter-protests from pro-choice activists. Operation Rescue lost the financial support of mainstream anti-abortion organizations like SPUC. And SPUC stands for Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child. And they were big. A few years later, they rebranded themselves as Voice for Life. But they were sort of the main anti-abortion group in New Zealand at the time. But by 1993, Operation Rescue had pretty much petered out. One casualty from this period was the Christchurch branch of SPUC, which was heavily involved in Operation Rescue. They were expelled from the national organization and rebranded themselves as Right to Life New Zealand. Oops. Oh, sorry. That's the Parkview Clinic with pictures of the Operation Rescue types. Now, one of the men of the Operation Rescue who attacked the Parkview Clinic was still attacking reproductive rights years later. Here he is, making a submission on the Safe Areas Bill. Jan Logie is calling him out for not mentioning his previous conviction from Parkview. So Operation Rescue highlights some of the similarities and differences between the US and New Zealand with respect to the far right's approach to clinic protests. In the US, Operation Rescue had the tacit acceptance of mainstream anti-abortion groups and financial support as well. This may be an indication that Operation Rescue's militancy increased donations across the anti-abortion spectrum. Now, in New Zealand, mainstream anti-abortion groups rejected Operation Rescue for their confrontational tactics. In both places, pro-choice groups met Operation Rescue actions with counter-protests, and they were a bit more successful in New Zealand. The US Operation Rescue had lots of money to gin up publicity and defend themselves in court. New Zealand Operation Rescue had very little money, which I believe had a lot to do with its short life. So how did Operation Rescue create the need for safe areas? Well, most of the tactics that we associate with clinic protests originated there with Operation Rescue. Their approach to patients was a big shift from mainstream anti-abortion groups. The mainstream groups had been open with their misogynistic rhetoric during the 1970s in the US, but found that it was bad for business. It put people off joining and it put people off donating. So they shifted to a new kind of benevolent sexism, alleging that women were not to blame for abortion because they just didn't understand what abortion was. When they appeared outside abortion clinics, they prayed or they approached people for sidewalk counseling. Operation Rescue really turned that around. They used patients as unwilling participants in violent street theater for the TV cameras. They likely did not prevent any abortions. They just rescheduled them. But that was not the point. The point was to raise the emotional cost of abortion by creating an atmosphere of violence, which created the need for safe areas. This was Operation Rescue's lasting legacy in New Zealand, creating that atmosphere and creating that need. One of the things that Al-Rans tried hard to get across to MPs during the safe areas submissions was that people attending abortion services weren't afraid that they were going to be prayed at or sung to. They were afraid of being physically attacked. The statistics from the National Abortion Federation show that this fear was well-founded. In our submission, Al Rand shared stories from people who had been harassed. Here is one. She says, when I was walking to the clinic to have my consultation, a woman who had been standing at the gate and presumably watched me drive in was walking behind me and started asking if I was going to the clinic. I just said, yep, and kept walking. She asked why, and I didn't answer. And then she yelled out, so you're going to kill your baby then? So you're a baby killer? I kept on walking. Then she started yelling some unintelligible shit and repeatedly saying baby killer, and then threw a cup at me. It might have been a Macca's cup. I don't really remember. It was probably only half full, I reckon, and ended up splashing all over my pants. So I just ran. Not quite as dramatic as I probably made it sound, but still, that's pretty damn bad. Self-righteousness is quite a drug. This is why safe areas are needed. People don't want protesters recording their rego plates or photographing their faces because they don't want to be targeted by randos. They don't want to have to fight their way into the service. Operation Rescue's legacy is fear. So finally, let's talk about some of the synergies that may have arisen between far-right ideology and the mainstream anti-abortion groups of New Zealand. So in New Zealand right now, the anti-abortion mainstream includes, well, the sort of person in the last slide. The abortion law reform process seems to have increased the radicalism on the part of more mainstream anti-abortion organizations. But antis in New Zealand are on the back foot. They are losing. 74% of New Zealanders support abortion on request and safe areas. Family First has recently lost its charitable status, so they know they have to be careful. A glance at the list of sponsors for March for Life, which is happening on Saturday, by the way, shows that they are mostly Pākehā, mostly fundamentalist Protestants, and conservative Catholics. This puts them far out of step with mainstream New Zealand, which is one of the most secular countries in the world, with half the people espousing no religion at all, according to census data. Antis look to the US for energy and ideas, but the US midterm elections have disappointed their hopes for identifying a winning strategy to advance their agenda. So more than a few of them have drawn closer to other elements of the far right. A number of anti-abortion folks were present at the occupation of the New Zealand Parliament. So are there synergies between garden variety far right and anti-abortion groups? Well, with respect to, for instance, white supremacy, anti-abortion ideology is quite compatible with white nationalism because natalism usually carries the underlying message of wanting more of the right kind of babies, meaning the white kind. But it works against them because it cuts them off from the possibility of a natural alliance that they've been trying to build over the years with Pacifica religious conservative types, and also cuts them off from Maori. And they've been trying to build bridges to both those groups. Anti-vax was a fit for a while because both groups kind of had the same view of science, which is that science is whatever we say it is. But now with the restrictions over, it's kind of passé. Anti-Semitism both fits and doesn't fit with the evangelical side of the movement. Evangelicals have traditionally supported Israeli apartheid moves in the hope of bringing on the end times. But Jewish tradition is pretty strongly pro-choice. That said, some anti-abortion supporters are quite happy to engage in anti-Semitism. Anti-LGBTQ fits in with the evangelical Protestant majority of mainstream anti-abortion groups, but it runs against, again, longstanding attempts to build bridges. Recently, someone pointed out a reference to pregnant people in anti-choice communications. That may be a one-off, or it may be an active decision. And finally, we get to the place with the big check mark: authoritarian politics. If there's one thing that the process of the legislation process of the Abortion Legislation Act showed them, was that they can't win in a democratic election or a democratic society. This increases the attraction of non-democratic political solutions, and therein lies the danger. So the question for those of us who would resist fascism on behalf of reproductive rights is, how do we protect our democratic institutions? That is a very big question, and probably not one that we could really address in the time that we have left tonight. So that is the question that I will leave you with. Thank you for your time.
Kia ora, Terry. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
No worries.
That was an awesome kōrero. Yeah, really appreciated the last little bit of kind of a comparison about where some of these groups are at in terms of the Parliament protest. Weirdly, lots of them didn't seem to have too many problems sitting alongside each other. So yeah, they're got some very distorted moral compasses there. So we're going to shift gears a little bit away from specifically the Operation Rescue and the New Zealand abortion movement, I guess, and over to Hannah Blake, who's going to talk a little bit about Christian fundamentalism and misogyny. So we'll shift gears a little bit. So over to you, Hannah.
Kia ora. So I'm Hannah Blake, and I was brought up in Christian fundamentalism. Probably people would know it under like evangelical culture in the States. I was homeschooled. I was home educated from age 5 to 16, and then I did my last 2 years of education in high school. And I left Christian fundamentalism at the age of 19, and I'm 31 now, so it's been a little while. But all my formative years were spent within almost entirely the Christian conservative fundamentalist culture that we have here in New Zealand. Most of my friends were in the culture. We spent a lot of time, most of our lives centered around variations of Christian belief and practice. The media we consumed, we didn't listen to any secular media. The books, we had 6 bookshelves full of books, and a good chunk of them were all Christian books. Of course, my education, and we went to several churches, as well as home churches. So I was fairly well drenched in it, and I am very familiar with that world. So I guess I just wanted to give a little bit of a perspective from that world now that I am out of it, and sort of talk about evangelical fundamentalist culture in New Zealand and Aotearoa, and what their goals are and who they are and why. Which is a lot to sum up in about 15 minutes, but we'll give it a crack. So I wanted to just define a couple of terms of reference. I'm going to refer to complementarianism or gender essentialism. So that's the concept that they have, which is that men and women are the only 2 genders that exist, that they are distinct and set, and they are have certain social roles, and they are set to fulfill those social roles. And if you step outside of that, society collapses, is essentially their perspective. So it isn't so much that they don't understand the perspective, it's that they refuse to understand the perspective of the queer community because their entire worldview is based around this gender essentialism. Evangelical is a catch-all term for the conglomeration of Christians who have a huge amount of different kinds of variations of belief. And you will find them. There's evangelical Catholics, there's evangelical Protestants, there's even, you will find them in each area. Something that makes a lot of sense to me is a concept that's put forward in a book called Jesus and John Wayne, which is focusing on American evangelicalism, but it explains it is that it's not so much like it's not a church, it's not a denomination, it's a consumer movement. So it's based off the media that people consume, books, speakers, TV shows, radio shows, music, all these kinds of things sort of represent this sort of fundamentalist evangelical movement. So it's very hard to pin down in terms of specifics, but some of the key things that are around them is they believe in biblical inerrancy, so the Bible is correct, and literalism, it's to be taken literally. And then they then take that, their literal interpretation of the Bible, and believe that the closest that we can get to in society to what they think the Bible says, then society will be okay. They think all the social ills in society are because we don't follow the Bible. And that the best thing that Christians can do for society is to try and push as much as they can for society to live up to these, what they call biblical principles. Or you might hear it termed as family values, as they can. And that is basically their driver, is that they are trying to entrench their version of society so that we'll follow it, because they believe that is what will lead to social success. And quite honestly, it's what entrenches a lot of the leaders' power. Christian nationalism is essentially follows on from this. It's a belief that a country needs to have Christian characteristics embedded in its society and laws, and that Christian values, Christian ideas, and by this I mean Western Christian ideas. It's usually, essentially, when they say Christian society and Christian heritage, they really mean Western society and Western heritage, and they want to privilege that over anything else. So basically, they see the world as a battlefield between Christian and anything else. And because of their belief system, most of them believe in a reality of a spiritual world where there are demons and angels battling it out all the time over social issues, over people. So a lot of things that they disagree with are often boiled down to powers of darkness. And so it becomes this sort of battle between good and evil, and they have to be the good guys because they believe in God and they are Christians. So anything that disagrees with them is bad. A lot of people seem, New Zealand is a more secular culture. And they see America as the bastion of evangelicalism and they think it is kind of a really small subculture in New Zealand. It is small, but it's also really hard to measure because, like I said, because it's more of a consumer culture than it is a denomination. It's almost impossible to measure statistically because you're not going to get people answering on statistics. Oh, I consume a lot of family first material. You're going to get them saying, oh, yeah, I go to a Catholic church, or I'm non-denominational. And it doesn't really capture how many people are being swayed by these talking points of this wider evangelical subculture. So just to bring it back a little bit to talk about this gender essentialism, I just kind of wanted to focus on why in the Christian right, it's not just about controlling, it's not just about sort of like being pro-life or anti-abortion control. It's basically the belief is that God created a man and a woman, and he commanded them to take over the world and fill it full of children. And he created the man first, and then he created the woman to help the man. And so men have a role of leadership and women have a whole role of helping. And anything that contradicts that is basically seen as, you know, that's it, that's the pinnacle of perfection right there. So anything that goes against that is seen as destroying society. So obviously, when it comes to things like women's rights, LGBTQ freedoms, like it essentially anything other than this version of men on top, women, and then lots of children, they refuse to believe that anything other than that could be good. And it's not a lack of comprehension. It is, this is how the world is made. And so it's a decision. They decide that that is what is good and what is bad. Because it is a media subculture, it can be really hard to track all the different movements and organizations and people. So it can seem as if there isn't one big movement. You know, you could say, look at Destiny Church. They're just a small part of the wider evangelical subculture. And they actually have a little bit more influence than a lot of people think. So moving on into Saturday, we've got the March for Life organised by a variety of groups, pushed mainly by Family First. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the groups that influence, that try and push for sort of like Christian nationalist ideals in our society, groups that I am familiar with because of my upbringing. So at the talk, at the march on Saturday, Focus on the Family New Zealand's going to be here. Now, Focus on the Family, they are an American group again, was founded in 1977 by Dr. James Dobson, an evangelical psychiatrist who focused on this version of the nuclear family as the key to overcoming all of society's ills. So as long as you had a man and a woman with children, and preferably they went to church, then, you know, society would kind of be okay. But the more what they termed broken families or whatever they were, then society wouldn't be okay. And that was their initial message. He very quickly got political though, and the political arm of Focus on the Family has been designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Centre, and they run a camp for girls here in New Zealand. They run marriage courses, they run sort of like courses for teens that are meant to teach them positive things but end up basically pushing propaganda. And they also run a group called Activate, which trains primarily young women how to be pregnancy crisis counsellors and how to push anti-abortion messaging on social media, how to effectively do that. So they basically run 8-week courses to try and push, because they're very good, the evangelical movement is very good at grasping onto new forms of media and using it to push their agenda. So they've really grasped onto social media. So they've got all these women raised in conservative Christianity that you know, go on Instagram or TikTok or whatever and try and push anti-abortion messaging in Aotearoa. So they were brought into New Zealand by Ian and Mary Grant. And Ian and Mary Grant were like really big authors in the 90s and the 2000s, and they were mainstreamed. People didn't really realize how conservative Christians they were, but trust me, they are conservative and Christian. They published parenting books. They even got a Queen's Service Medal. They ran the parenting place. They sit on the board of Family First New Zealand. So if you have any doubts as to how conservative and Christian they are, they brought in Focus on the Family. They sit on the board of Family First New Zealand. Their daughter is the wife of Christopher Luxon's former pastor, if you have any doubts as to how conservative his church was. And they have pushed a huge amount of, again, this sort of like media that isn't necessarily overtly Christian, but brings people into the evangelical Christian subculture where they're often then sort of get sucked more and more into the counterculture movement. And then a little bit of throwback, although they still exist, we've got the Maxim Institute, which was a think tank, which started by Bruce Logan. And he started Cutting Edge, which was the precursor to Maxim Institute, which was a published magazine from the New Zealand Education Development Foundation that pushed charter schools, pushed homeschooling, pushed very blatant anti-homosexuality, anti-trans messaging, a lot of fear-mongering, pushed replacement theory, all of this. And a lot of the people that were involved in the New Zealand Education Development Foundation, you know, they went on to have key roles in things like Bethlehem College and Laidlaw College and things like that. So they all organised, lobbied the government. They even got the Governor General to give a talk in 1999 about how all these family values and everything were great and we needed to have more Christian heritage in New Zealand, and the church should be entwined with the state. So he resigned in disgrace in 2006 because he plagiarized a bunch of stuff from America and got caught out. That same year was when Family First New Zealand started, and it was started by Bob McCoskrie, who used to be a talk show radio host on Radio Rima, and he basically picked up exactly where Bruce Logan left off. And even though Maxim Institute still exists, and it's still conservative and it still has roots, it decided to pull back from its overtly Christian messaging, and it now pushes in the areas of conservative finance. Mostly, they do have other things, but that's mostly what a lot of the publications is. Family First New Zealand is now one of the main political Christian groups that aren't trying to overtly get into parliament, that are trying to influence society, education, and politics on behalf of basically evangelical Christian nationalism. This year, Bob Bukowski visited Hungary and spoke in praise of Viktor Orban's government. He uses media from things like libs of TikTok. He uses every single piece of propaganda that he can find to raise fear in the Christian community. And because he has been in the Christian community for so long, he actually has a lot of influence. His material is spread around a lot of Christian schools. He's listened to in a lot of different Christian churches and schools and homes. And he works in conjunction with Focus on the Family New Zealand to push a lot of propaganda. So I have watched his messaging. Although the messaging has stayed fairly consistent, it has gotten even more blatant given the political situation in the United States. And he is definitely trying to capitalize on the turmoil that's happened with the COVID situation to try and prey on those levels of distrust with the government, to try and say, we've got the answer, it's Christian nationalism, basically. Yeah, that's it. That is me.
Wow, Hannah, that was an amazing, amazing survey of the, I guess, of the scene across Aotearoa, and certainly prompts for me a number of questions, I guess, to ask you when we get to that part of the discussion. Yeah, really, really fascinating stuff to see, to hear about where all these groups have come from, and some of those links that kind of overlap a little bit with what Terry's saying about a relationship with the United States, and also their admiration of people like Viktor Orban and other authoritarians and crypto-fascists in Europe. So on that note, we're going to turn to our final speaker, and then we'll have some opportunity for some questions at the end. So yeah, please do feel free to post any of those questions or thoughts into the chat, and we'll get to those when we get to the end. But I want to hand over to Angus Lindsay. Angus, you are on. Thank you very much for being with us.
Kia ora, thank you. Just want to sort of thank you all for coming and hearing me yarn about this, or hearing us yarn about this really difficult issue and these intersecting problems. Today I'm going to be talking about incels. Just want to kind of give a little bit of a warning that some of the quotes that I've chosen to use in this slideshow here are quite graphic, and I'll be discussing mass violence. So please take care of yourself and feel free to leave if it is too much for you. But yeah, so in an attempt to connect with Terry and Hannah's cogent discussions on how misogyny and the far right intersect, I'll be discussing this extreme manifestation of male supremacist ideology, the involuntary celibate or incel subculture. I'll begin by kind of providing a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the incel subculture from my master's research, and first providing some background by briefly unpacking the kind of connections between incels and other iterations of men's rights and male supremacist cultures. Then I'm going to discuss the incel worldview and belief system, a pseudo philosophy known as the Black Pill, and detail some of its core ideas that underpin this belief system. My hope today is to kind of reflect that the understanding that these cultures and these ideas are interconnected, and especially within the online ecosystems that these communities inhabit, the beliefs, ideas, and political tactics of male supremacist groups kind of cross-pollinate with the far right, and that these tactics are undergirded and largely allowed by these digital platforms and the lax moderation processes that enable these socially corrosive forces to proliferate. Unlike Hannah and Terry, I won't really be talking about the New Zealand context, as I found little solid evidence of New Zealand-based incels operating in this country. But I just do want to note that there's been some recent OAAs to the New Zealand SIS, and I have had some conversations with various government agencies that have revealed that this is an increasingly concerning and an increasing concern and risk for some of these agencies. So yeah. So since 2014, involuntary celibates or incels have received an increasing amount of attention after several mass murders have been attributed to the extreme fringes of this loosely organized digital community. Incel groups are predominantly comprised of socially alienated men who describe themselves as being unable to find women who are willing to engage in romantic relationships with them, a state that they refer to as inceldom. Incels appear to experience a deep sense of social and sexual alienation from broader society, and many claim that they suffer from severe anxiety and depressive and autism spectrum disorders. And they also often describe being bullied and lonely throughout their lives. Much of the harm that incels perpetrate is situated online. You might have seen them trolling in comment threads on Reddit or other online forums, espousing racist and gendered hate speech elsewhere online. And incels have also been deeply involved in hacking, doxing of activists, creating deepfake pornography, and the kind of publishing or the publication of celebrity nudes. But the incel identity is most characterized by this kind of this strong sense of victimization and misery, and the lashing out, the extreme violent events that is associated with this identity. And the first incel to kind of garner mainstream attention was Elliot Rodger, who on the evening of the 23rd of May 2014 released a YouTube video titled Elliot Rodger's Retribution. And he also released online an autobiographical manifesto entitled My Twisted World, The Story of Elliot Rodger. He then went out and conducted a killing spree, aiming to punish women for his involuntary celibacy. So it ended with the death of 6 people and the injury of 14 others, and then Rodger's own suicide. Coverage of the event and his online activity revealed Rodger as a young man that was extremely lonely, hated women, and was just intensely misogynistic. And this was essentially what was the beginning of what we now know as the incel problem. And following on from this, influenced by Rodger's rampage, an ex-recruit of the Canadian Armed Forces, Alec Manassian, drove a rented van through the busy streets in the Toronto CBD district in 2018, killing 10 and wounding 16. Since these high-profile attacks, several more incel and misogynist-inspired attackers have waged terroristic acts against women, and it has resulted in upwards of 60 deaths since Rodger's initial attacks. Mostly these have been situated throughout North America, but several of these attacks have been widely publicized. But there has been quite a few other less publicized attacks that have also taken place, as well as there's been a number of interventions by state agencies, particularly in the US and Canada, but also here in New Zealand, where incels have been cited as a growing area of concern of violent extremism, particularly citing incel ideology as a gateway to white supremacist extremism. Just 1 second. Sorry about that. So in my research on incels, which analyzed the cultures of 2 separate online forums, a Reddit and a standalone website, there was often not a clear distinction between anti-feminist and anti-women discussions. This was found alongside racist and white supremacist ideology. These themes coexisted, but all incel-related attackers primarily or symbolically target the young women that incels feel so marginalized by through their perceived sexual and social poverty. And they each hold this uniting, connected belief of hatred against the women that they feel an overwhelming sense of entitlement towards. So moving to kind of tracing these kind of contemporary anti-feminist men's rights movements, we're going to the manosphere. So the digital social networks that encompass the anti-feminist men's rights community are collectively known as the manosphere, which refers to an array of interconnected yet distinct activist groups with a very heavy online vocal presence who largely promote a heteronormative, sexist, misogynistic, and at times racist belief system. In the digital era, this kind of mass proliferation of easily accessible public spaces and information seems to have accelerated and amplified the spread of this hateful misogynistic ideology. And so Jacqueline Friedman here provides quite a helpful description of the manosphere. But many of the members of these communities adhere to the red pill pseudo-philosophy, which purports to awaken men to feminism's misandry and brainwashing, and it draws from the 1999 film The Matrix. And essentially to be red-pilled means to be kind of awakened to the realization that one lives within some kind of false reality. To the manosphere, this reality believes that women have created and employed and constructed feminist ideas and inserted them to all areas of society in order to reduce the rights of men and to give women disproportionate amounts of power in society. Rooted within these ideas and narratives associated with the red pill are echoes of biological and determinist ideas of gender and race. These assemblages of online anti-feminist men's groups use a cachet of entirely discredited or cherry-picked interpretations of genetics and neuroscience that explain so-called alpha and beta forms of masculinity, things like pickup strategies, and this is viewed alongside scientific, so-called scientific justifications of white supremacy. In these spaces, the kind of central unifying narrative that groups mobilize to reinforce their own personal narratives of suffering and to kind of build a kind of consensus to a so-called collective gendered experience, the supposed oppression of men due to women and feminism. For these men, this is like the core of the crisis of masculinity, this idea that power has been taken from them by women and by feminists. So moving on to the black pill, more specifically with the incels here. So I think of the black pill as kind of like a turbocharged version of the ideas that are associated with the red pill. Incels have introduced the black pill that, if metaphorically swallowed, it makes one aware of the so-called unchanging nature of reality, that the world is stacked against low status men in favor of women and alpha males, and that there can be no personal solutions to the so-called systemic oppression, and that the world was, is, and always will disadvantage those genetically inferior incels. And finally, that women are inherently wired to prefer men with particular physical features over others. So for the more extreme adherents of this worldview, it's impossible to escape from this so-called social hierarchy that excludes them. Here I've put on screen here one of the understandings of the black pill from one of the website, the Incel website that I studied. But overall, the kind of black pill seems to simplistically categorize people into a three-tiered system. And this hierarchy is primarily based on physical attraction, with a minority of alpha males and desirable females, known as Stacys, said to be located at the top. A majority of kind of average-looking betas or normies follow, and then a minority of physically unpleasant, exclusively male incels are found at the bottom. And kind of through the black pill worldview, these structural hierarchies are fixed, and transcending one's genetics is impossible. No matter how much you go to the gym or how good your personality is, if you're on that bottom rung of the ladder, women are not going to be interested in you. And this kind of belief is in immovable structures is a key feature of extremist worldviews, and the nihilistic worldview of the black pill seems to have influenced terroristic behavior by incels, such as Elliot Rodger or Alec Manassian, who have attempted these kind of violent retributions against those who are perceived to hold a higher social status. And, you know, so incels just really place this immense belief in an idea that factors such as genetic, social, and economic conditions are determined, and that society is set up and somehow structured to exclude and to oppress them, incels, them being incels. And this has kind of resulted in incels feeling that they are highly oppressed and victimized. Even if they hold structural privileges, such as being white middle-class men, and often they are from the global north context from what we know. But the ideas and discussions of incels' feelings of powerlessness and alienation are kind of regularly infused with the so-called scientific justifications from these archives of crowdsourced black pill knowledge. This kind of cachet of cherry-picked and misinterpreted evolutionary biology, pop psychology, and race science is used to explain their collective inceldom. And it's through these sources that incels believe things such as that women all have a purely animalistic desire to solely seek to maximize the social, economic, and genetic potential of their children by choosing so-called high status or high value men, which of course necessarily excludes incels, as they cannot compete with these so-called high value alpha males. And this is where the incel culture kind of intersects with the pickup artistry and game communities of the manosphere, which we have a plethora of influencers who claim to teach young men how to pick up women, how to make money, how to become so-called high status males. And I think a recent example that many may be familiar with would be Andrew Tate, who has been widely criticized for his extremely violent and misogynistic comments about women, but also charging young men a premium to learn his supposed secrets of success. But anyway, so through a kind of combination of discredited science, anti-Semitic and anti-feminist conspiracy theories and worldviews, the red pill and black pills come to this idea that sort of feminism and multiculturalism is to blame for men's supposed declining positions within the sexual marketplace, but also more society more generally. And we can see through incel discourse that the kind of ideas of the black pill are fundamentally rooted in this kind of this past golden age, this nostalgic time of a patriarchal society where monogamy is the rule, traditional gender roles are accepted and followed, and women and men marry early, and adultery is prohibited. And during this kind of mythologized golden era, it is imagined that men had near unencumbered access to women as romantic partners, and thereby reducing the competition for sex and romance, which of course incels are primarily driven by. In this way, we can see that incels, through the logics of the black pill, really do what they can to kind of rail against both women and feminism for their perceived alienation, and are always ready to try to roll back any progression towards gender equality. Throughout my research, it became clear that these kind of perceived oppressions and the science of the black pill structured incels' worldview, led to a kind of normalization and like a constant dehumanization of women and other outgroups. And I think that, incels incessantly depicted these outgroups as negative and as often as an existential threat to incels. And sort of, I guess, due to the fixed nature of their worldview, some incels see that violence is the only logical answer to their problems. We can see comments on incel forums that just regularly advocate for extreme violence against the outgroup members, particularly women. And I think that this reinforces this collective identity of alienation and suffering. I believe that the incel subculture is quite a good example of how these ideas throughout the manosphere are kind of cross-pollinating and evolving and being kind of worked out online through memes, hyperlinking of different articles and videos, the kind of overlapping interests and supposed grievances that these cultures hold in common. I think these ideas are able to be turbocharged and sort of figured out through these online forums before being deployed into the kind of into the rest of the online and offline world. And the science of the black pill, the red pill, or these other cultural tropes and stories, they really appeal to these alienated young men. And I think these interests are also then underpinned by hardened misogynistic attitudes that call for the reassertion of patriarchal societies through these militant forms of misogyny. And I think that these deeply embedded gender constructions are directly influenced by the far right, and we can sort of see some of these gender constructions through Hannah's discussion as well. But I think incel ideas are rooted within histories of white supremacy and theories of biological and genetic positivism, but they're also responding to broader changes in the political economy that have triggered these feelings of threat to men's otherwise previously unparalleled power within our patriarchal society. And I think further that the kind of configuration of technology, the racist and anti-feminist ideologies, and the kind of emotional appeals and calls to action are kind of features that this wider manosphere shares, and they kind of fluidly coalesce when the political when there's a contingent political need. So I think these configurations are mediated through and afforded by the technological platforms such as incel forums or social media, and are easily accessible with an internet connection, right? So and these affordances allow for this continuous connection and social engagement with hateful discourses. So these incel users can choose to be in continuous contact with extremist worldviews, with white supremacy, with black pill worldviews. And despite reporting being isolated in the offline world, actively engaged incels are far from being isolated online. These kind of negative experiences with women and with outgroups offline appear to lead to feelings of loneliness and resentment and hate. And they then combine, these feelings then combine with the kind of echo chamber effects of incel forums. Young men find the so-called scientific justifications to rationalize their perceived social and sexual alienation. And this leads to feelings of hatred and possibly violent actions against the outgroup, which are encouraged within these online communities. And I think just lastly, it's important for us to remember, and I'm sure we're all aware that these worldviews do not originate in isolation. You know, they're part of this broader structure of beliefs that already exist within our society. For incels, these beliefs are interconnected through this constellation of men's rights and manosphere groups and alt-right groups that sort of compose these online networks. The creation of this hatred and the occasional violence also transcends this sort of false distinction between the online and the offline. The two are connected. The production and acceptance of violence, particularly against women, and the creation of harmful hierarchies of difference are founded on the conceptual apparatus of patriarchy and racial capitalism, and the normalization and acceptance of such violence within broader society. And these ideas are embodied and accepted and emboldened and extended through these tight echo chambers that influence these violent misogynists. So just to kind of, in blaming these kind of ideas as such as feminism and multiculturalism for the alienation and the anxieties that these incels experiences, their solutions to the issues that they experience are often to, at the minimum, reduce women's rights through a return to a so-called golden age of patriarchy. This return will supposedly heal what they perceive to be a decaying society that has developed from the acceptance of feminist ideas and values. But the normalization of daily male aggression and violence against women and the very real political projects, such as the one that we will be countermarching against this Saturday, reflects these historical patriarchal legacies. But the famous incel-caused violent events discussed at the beginning kind of provide us with a face or a scapegoat to point at and direct whatever feelings are invoked. They allow us to kind of imagine that such violence may be extraordinary, but we need to remember that the kind of toxic daily interactions that incels have with each other and with other women, with women, are just one example of the daily forms of violence against women when male violence is normalized and at times valorized within our society. Thank you. I know that was a lot.
Thanks, Angus. That was awesome. Thank you very, very much. And that is all of our speakers. So we're going to turn to some question time. There's lots of stuff in the chat that we might try to work through, and really happy for people to put some questions in there. I'll try to have a look through those. I've got lots of questions, and I guess one of the things that I felt like all of you talked a little bit about is kind of the relationship between this sort of sense of victimization, both within the kind of fundamentalist Christian community, the sense of victims being victims, or within the anti-abortion movement of being victims, and this idea of the decaying society. So the first question I really wanted to ask to Terry, and probably to a lesser extent to Hannah, was, Terry, you said the US is a super spreader for anti-abortion politics. Can you talk a little bit about who the specific organizations are that are those super spreaders, and are they active in New Zealand? Hannah mentioned the focus on the family. Are there others? Are there other ones that are operating that we don't really know about?
I would say probably the second. There probably are plenty others that we don't really know about, but there is a plethora of think tanks and organizations that, bring money together in the States whose ultimate goal is to spread what they've got. I'm thinking particularly of the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers are very, very rich people who, I think one of them is dead now, who I believe, if memory serves, they bankrolled challenges to the abortion laws in the UK, and also challenges, like the clinic harassment in the UK. That's been undergoing a bit of a renaissance, unfortunately, for the past few years. And it's, yeah, that's the kind of the reason that Ealing put together their own, local law against anti-abortion harassment around their abortion clinic. But yeah, you can think of the usual suspects like Right to Life, or again, or Focus on the Family. Focus on the Family I was really glad to hear more about them from Hannah's perspective, because they do a lot of work in that area. The main anti-abortion groups in New Zealand are, Voice for Life, Right to Life New Zealand, and Family First, Family Life International, Pro-Life, which is an offshoot of Family Life International. Again, it's kind of the same. It's kind of the usual suspect.
Cool. Thank you very much. Yes. And I guess just as a follow-on from that, Hannah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned at one point Christopher Luxon and the influence. What was it? His former pastor's partner. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about, if you know, sort of, I guess, about the representation of evangelicals inside of Parliament, inside of political parties? Like, are they a number of years ago we had the Brethren, the exclusive Brethren, seeking to influence quite a lot of political action that was kind of exposed. They were very involved with the National Party. Are you aware of more of that kind of stuff going on? You're on mute, by the way. Sorry.
There we go. Sorry, I'm terrible with names, but I mean, obviously, Christopher Luxon comes from an evangelical background. You've got Simeon, who was same age as me, and who was raised homeschooled in the same kind of culture I was. So I am not aware of him having left it. So I suspect that he is extremely conservative. You got I've forgotten the name, it escaped me, of the MP that's Catholic that quoted Latin. And
Simon O'Connor?
Yes, yeah, so you've got him. He's definitely not necessarily evangelical in the sense of evangelical Protestant. I would say he's in the same sort of media consumer culture of that wider sort of movement from his rhetoric.
The other thing I wanted to ask you was, you talked about this kind of consumer culture of evangelical Christianity. Are there some very specific New Zealand characteristics of that consumer culture?
It's funny because New Zealand has this weird sort of like way of being associated with a bunch of these people. Like Derek Prince, who was the founder of some of the really big, you don't hear his name as much anymore, but he came up with a lot of the evangelical concepts that are popularized now, because they all essentially plagiarize each other's work. He had a huge association with New Zealand. You have Chuck Missler, who popularized the idea of demonic aliens and transhumanism and all that kind of thing. that was popularized in the church 20 years ago. We hear about it now, right? But that kind of concept was mainstreamed 20 years ago by Chuck Missler, who came to New Zealand to die. You've got just a variety. The homeschooling, New Zealand has some of the most lax homeschooling laws in the Western world. We are incredibly permissive. We have basically no checks and balances, and that has been pushed for, lobbied for by Christian homeschooling culture when it started. And you've got a lot of people from that very fundamentalist, very extremely conservative, have interest in New Zealand as basically we were their backup if the USA continued towards their version of liberalism. So their plan was just to basically come over and politically lobby to take over. They actually bought, one group bought a media centre in Christchurch that was in the Christchurch building that collapsed. Some of them made sure to have their kids here so they could come back and be eligible to run for Prime Minister. We narrowly missed having, you've got from Above Rubies, you've got Nancy Campbell. They've got a huge, very woman and children focused Christian nationalist magazine that started here in New Zealand and is now published from where they're centered in America. But she is a Kiwi, and they just happened to move to America 20 years later, but it was all started here. So yeah, there's a definite, a large amount of sort of groups and ties to this country specifically that people just generally aren't aware of. Oh, you got the ATI? They had a Hobby Lobby bought big house and institution for them in Martin, and they even got contracts with the Ministry of Education for at-risk youth, which for what was basically a conversion therapy centre in the early 2000s, and they pushed a very conservative version of homeschooling curriculum that still exists. They just don't have, they sold the house in 2019. But yeah, so you've got all these kinds of things that, yeah, just people don't realize because they're not part of the Christian subculture.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Angus, there's a couple of questions for you in the chat. And I guess one I wanted to highlight particularly was one from Susan, just wondering how this research into the incel movement might have affected you personally, and curious about what ideas you might have for how our impressionable young men might resist some of the ideas promoted by this incel movement. Asking because I work in a school and the ideas of Andrew Tate do have some traction with our young men.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first of all, just how it affected me, or how it is affecting me, I guess. I'm no stranger to, as a 30-year-old extremely online person, I am not a stranger to I haven't been a stranger growing up to a lot of the negative and harmful and disgusting things online. I think that has undoubtedly shaped the way that I see the world and the lens that I see the world through. I think for me, it was, times of, during the research process, there was just a lot of feelings of disgust, a lot of feelings of almost in some ways helplessness, and sort of apathy, and it was a dark time, and I think a way through that for me was reflexive journaling, and as a kind of, I guess, a research method, and sort of just trying to write about my feelings, basically around what I was seeing, what I was analyzing, what I was trying to understand and trying to get to the bottom of. But I think it's ongoing. It's not it's not like, oh yeah, I put down the masters now and it's all done, and cells aren't a thing in my brain anymore. I mean, I don't study them on a daily basis anymore. But these ideas, when you become really, really familiar with them, you see them emanating throughout other forms of societies, other forms of kind of misogyny within society, just even with conversations with friends, people at the gym, that sort of idea. Like these ideas are bloody common, you know. And I think, you know, to your second question, and I think to Brodie's question as well, I guess, you know, I think we need to continue to we need to remember that that there's incels that are not good or evil, that they're not, incel communities are neither, that we should try to avoid looking at them through this binary lens of bad versus good. We should understand that these are sort of social spaces for individuals to meet and kind of discuss with others who have had similar experiences in life, and you know, centered around these unfortunate experiences of dating and romance, and these kind of crushing expectations of a narrow lens through which society envisions the ideal man. I think we need to kind of recognize that it's the kind of social and cultural conditions rather than like monstrous people who produce these heinous deeds. And I think when we can start to think about it, the problem in that way, we can then, rather than sort of policing and counter-terrorism, whatever the counter-terrorism lens like the US and Canada are kind of focusing on, we can kind of begin to respond to these kind of rigid gender expectations that society places on men and boys, and to kind of deconstruct these problematic aspects of hegemonic or dominant forms of masculinity and patriarchal social relations. So, you know, I think taking a balanced and empathetic approach of carefully engaging men to kind of face up to the reality of their role in oppression, not just incels, but men generally, right? While also not downplaying the extent of violence that women suffer at the hands of men. So I think we need to take this balanced approach here through kind of empathy and care to avoid kind of pushing these young men and boys towards these anti-feminist ideologies that permeate through these online and offline social spaces. I think, you know, more work needs to be done to deconstruct these problematic aspects of masculinity, and this needs to start in families, in the homes, in our communities, in schools. And I know there are some really great programs that are going on, completely underfunded. So, you know, give them more money, help them do that work as well. I guess that's probably all I could offer there.
Kia ora. Terry, Hannah, is there anything else that I think we're about to close for the night? So if either one of you have got any closing thoughts that you want to add before we wrap up?
I just want to thank everyone for this discussion. This has been really interesting and really rich. So thank you.
Kia ora, Terry. Hannah, you're on mute again.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for listening. When I started talking about this, I had no idea of the kind of reception I'd get. So it's pretty encouraging that there's people out there that are wanting to listen and learn about something that had not just a big impact on my life, but impact on the social and political scene in New Zealand.
Kia ora. Well, thank you all. Thank you, the three of you, very much. I think what's fascinating is that, you know, when we set about to organize this webinar, it's like juxtaposing these three topics together. They're obviously enormous issues in and of themselves, but what is I suppose terrifying is the extent of the overlap and the intersection of all of these things that you three have talked about, and I guess the contemporary context that we all find ourselves in trying to come to terms with you know, the social media environment, the wider political context, the economic situation that has, and the kind of contraction of capitalism and colonialism that has put us in this place that we are in at the end of 2022, where we see rising white nationalism, where we see the retrenchment of these kinds of ideas, where we see, people out, and the kind of weird intermarriage of a lot of ideas that we never would have put together. So I really, really appreciate you all putting so much time and effort into preparing for this kōrero tonight, and to everybody who joined us in the kōrero. There are lots and lots of messages of appreciation and thanks in the chat, so I hope you take an opportunity to have a look at those. If people do have further questions, you can put them on our Poneki Anti-Fascist Action Facebook page, and we will get those to Terry, to Hannah, or to Angus. If you've got specific things about their work that you'd like to reach out. I know Hannah is on Twitter. I'm not sure about the social media presence of the other two, but you can always reach out to them, probably directly as well. So I just want to again say thanks everybody for your time, and I just want to close with a little karakia whakakapi. And before I say the karakia, I just tell you, because it's such a lovely karakia for closing this. It says, from the confusion comes understanding, from the understanding comes unity. We are interwoven, we are interconnected, we are interwoven, we are interconnected together as one. So, he karakia tātou. Unuhia te pō whirimarama. Tomokia te ao whatu tangata. Tatai ki runga, tatai ki raro, tatai aho rau. Haumie huie, tai kie. Thank you again, everybody, for being with us tonight. Ka kite anō.